All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for kind of coming out tonight. And my name is Tim Clymer. I'm from Threefold Farm. As Steve mentioned, we're located in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. So for those of you not familiar, wholly familiar with Pennsylvania, that's kind of south central to southeast Pennsylvania. We got started just a few years ago. We purchased this property at the end of 2014, kind of cover cropped it in 2015, converted it over from corn and soybean fields. And it had been a couple of things previous to that. And then planted our first commercial crops 2016 with brambles and kiwi berries, followed up with pawpaws, figs in 2017, and then continued to plant figs, persimmons, and some jujubes as well. So we like to call ourselves a farm of unusual fruits. And the reason for choosing unusual fruits was somewhat a practical one, in that we live in a pretty big fruit belt. So the county south of us, we are in Cumberland County. There's a county south of us, Adams County, which is where Gettysburg is. They are a huge region or a huge county for apple and stone fruit production. The top in the state and probably one of the top 5 in the country. And so we knew we couldn't compete with some larger growers in that space. And my wife and I are relatively new to farming. My training is as a software developer. And so I left software development back in 2013, interned for a year at an orchard, and then jumped into this full time. And so we knew we couldn't compete there. We also knew that as new growers, we couldn't start off growing organic apples and peaches. I feel like that's kind of the big leagues. And so we knew we wanted to start with something that perhaps was a little, honestly, just a little easier to do and grow organically. It didn't require the kinds of sprays that apples and peaches would. So we settled in on some fruits that we still think are great, but are a little easier that way, and that we could carve out a niche for ourselves. So I'm going to talk you through, in this sort of brief hour that we have, the sort of planning process that goes into an orchard, to planting, to harvest, and then finally marketing. And I'm going to try to cover that all in an hour. So we might be kind of a mile wide, an inch deep, but bear with me here. So just to give you maybe a little better idea of where we're situated and what we're working with climate-wise, I was sort of wholly unfamiliar with the Iowa climate going into this, and so I did a little bit of research just to see what where you guys were zone-wise. And if I go back and forth between y'all and you guys, it's because I was born here, but we lived in Texas for a couple years. So we are in a pretty solid zone 6B here, but you can see Pennsylvania is pretty varied. Starting down in Philadelphia, that there's a little spot there of 7B, and probably most winters, or a lot of winters, they might be closer to an 8A, all the way up to northern Pennsylvania, where it's they say 5A, but I'm sure some winters they get down to, and they're a 4B. And so it looks like Steve has popped up this little poll here. If y'all want to stick in your growing zone, that might help inform a little bit of what I talk about here. It looks like most of Iowa was in zone 4 to sort of 5B, from what I saw. Now our region, growing degree day wise, looked pretty similar. First and last frost looked pretty similar. I imagine you perhaps get a few warmer days in summer than us, and most likely colder in the winter. We're blessed here with really good, pretty deep limestone, kind of silt loam soils. We're in the same valley. If you're familiar with Lancaster area, they're renowned for having really great topsoils. So we're really thankful to have good topsoil in our area with kind of a clay, but not too sort of mucky subsoil. So most, oops, I got ahead of myself there. Most winters were a 7A climate. We have maybe 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 winters where we barely break into the single digits. So that's not uncommon. So we do get some breaks in winters where some of our crops like figs do a little bit better. Okay, so it looks like result-wise, most of y'all are in zone 5A, 5, a little bit of 6, a little bit of 7. So that's really good to know. So here's a picture of our farm. As you drive in, what you see is our bramble planting. We have about 1.25 acres of brambles split more or less. We tend more heavily towards the red and yellow raspberries, although we have some black raspberries which are native to us, and then some blackberries. Blackberries do pretty well, both the primocane and the floricane types. In the back there you see our kiwi berry planting on an overhead trellis. In the lower left, you'll see that as well. We grow this on a 5-wire overhead trellis. And just to show you that we actually do produce pawpaws, there's a cluster of some of ours. Now we do have I mentioned we planted those in 2017, which would mean they really aren't bearing yet. They'll come into bearing next year, but we do have an older planting at an older location where we get the majority of our fruits now, but the next one will come into bearing next year. And then I'd wanted to include a picture of figs just because they're a really beautiful fruit, and just to show you the variation in color. There's even more variation than that, but some of our figs on the farm. So I'd like to encourage you as we go through this. I'd be happy to answer your questions as we go. If there's some questions that maybe are best dealt with at the end, I'll hold them off. But as we go, if there's something that I don't cover very well or leave you with some lingering questions, please use the Q&A feature, and I'd be glad to answer your questions. So when going into planting an orchard, when going into planting our orchard, I knew that I needed to get things right. So if you're a vegetable grower, you have the opportunity every year to shift around maybe your spacing between plants or your irrigation, or maybe you choose some different varieties that are maybe more resistant than the ones you planted last year. So if everything's a wash or everything just doesn't turn out well one year, you have the opportunity to redo things and sort of get a fresh start the next year. I knew that wasn't true in the orchard. A lot of the decisions that you're making, you're going to have to live with for the life of the planting. And so it's really critical when you're planting an orchard to put thought into it so that you get things as close to right as possible. So you'll never get every decision right, but getting it close is helpful. And so when you're planting the orchard, one of the things you need to take consideration of is just your growing conditions. So that can include soil type and fertility, drainage patterns, weed issues, pest concerns. If you have some areas on your farm that don't drain particularly well, fruit trees aren't fond of standing in water. If there's persistent weed issues that are going to compete with your fruit trees or bushes, that's something that needs to be addressed ahead of time. And then pest concerns, both big and small. So these could be as small as nematodes that could cause havoc or wreak havoc with some types of fruit trees. and also the small and large furry creatures that like to nibble on fruit trees and hurt your investment. So if there are those concerns, certainly be thinking about those. We made a decision early on to fence in our orchard to sort of exclude deer from the onset, but we still certainly have ongoing concerns with rabbits and voles and other things. So the other thing to be aware of, and this can even vary in your little pocket of land, is just the different conditions. So do you have good air drainage on your land? Does it have a slight slope to it? You might consider putting maybe your more sensitive plants on a slope to avoid frosts. What are your rainfall patterns, and will you need to invest in irrigation? Do you have enough growing degree days to ripen the crops that you're looking to grow? And if not, are there some shorter season varieties that might do better for you? And then temperature extremes. Are your crops that you're trying to grow going to make it in your climate? So some of the crops some of the plants we'll be talking about today might max out in zone 5. And not to say they won't grow a little colder than that, but some extra care may need to be taken to help ensure their survival. And then certainly variety selection. You want to give yourself every advantage you can, especially if you're going to be looking at a low or no spray program. Disease resistance is sort of paramount. Taste certainly also factors in, but disease resistance is a huge win if you're growing something especially that's prone to diseases in your area. Now, if you're out west in the dry, sort of farming the desert, that may not be a concern. But if you live in hot, humid climates like I believe we all do here so far, then disease resistance should be near the top of your list. I stick this slide up here not because it's a lot of fun, but because I think it's something we easily neglect when we're looking at planning the orchard. Budgeting is not a term that anyone likes to hear, but it's important really if you're getting into a special perennial crops like fruit trees and bushes to be realistic with your numbers. It's easy to kind of just think, well, trees cost, $10 to $20 a piece. So if I need 100 trees, that's $1,000 or $2,000 when really you need to factor in infrastructure and irrigation and the time of pruning and fertilizer. And so that there's a lot of different things that come into play. And one resource that I found to be helpful, even though it's mostly a conventional guide and we're transitional organic, is the Penn State has a tree fruit production guide. And I imagine there's some other ones out there, but they have a section in there for budgets for planting out different types of crops. And those could easily be adapted to unusual fruits. But it's just good because they lay out every single cost and the relative cost per acre kind of each. Another thing that you might consider if you are getting into orchards the first time is just to experiment on kind of a small scale. See certainly if you like orchard work, but then just to get an idea of what you're up against. We've settled on planting an acre to about an acre and a half every year, primarily because it's mostly my wife and I, and we just that's what we've decided that we can plant and take care of well in a year's time frame. And so you kind of get that idea from smaller plantings that you do and how much time each of those activities take. It might sound counterintuitive here to talk about marketing when you're planning your orchard, but I read an article recently by a farmer starting out giving advice to people getting into farming, and he mentioned marketing at the top of his list, and I would having been in it for a few years now, I would tend to agree. I think I had this sort of Pollyannish view that, if you grow it, they will come, and that's true to some degree, but it's not completely true. And so, where do you want to uh, have your outlets, and is it realistic to market some or all of your crop to those outlets? So initially, when we formed our orchard, we had this sort of, like I said, Pollyannish view that we would open it for you-pick, and that you-pick customers would just pick it clean, every day, and what was left over, what minimal amount was left over, we could market at our farm stand here, and that just turned out not to be the case. That was overly optimistic, and so be realistic about your marketing efforts, and your outlets. Be prepared to sell some or a good portion of your fruit wholesale, or be prepared to perhaps spend a good significant portion of your time at farmers markets if that's what you'd prefer to do. But be realistic about your retail avenues. And then sourcing. Sourcing some of our plants is difficult because they're not the apples and peaches that are sort of readily available from wholesale nurseries and grafted in mass quantities. A lot of our plants are available sort of only at specialty nurseries, and typically only in small quantities. And so if you're looking for 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 of a plant of something like pawpaws, it's going to be a little more difficult to locate perhaps the amount and the varieties that you want. Have a good source of growing and planting supplies that you can have readily available, hopefully locally, preferably locally. And then order in advance if there's some fruit tree places. If you want a particular variety, you're going to have to order maybe a couple years in advance if you want significant quantities. So just be prepared that's not always the case, that you can just get it with pretty little notice. All right, so planting out the orchard. Our particular method, what we settled in on after a few years of doing this, we have sort of a short timeline here of 3 to 4 years out. We're doing our researching, planning, we're choosing our varieties. If we need to, we're ordering that far out. So far, we've only needed to maybe order a year or so out. But certainly, if you're going to be doing apples and peaches and pears, and you want certain varieties with certain rootstocks, that's sometimes at least a 3 to 4 year wait. 1 to 2 years out, what we've settled in on is when we have bare ground, we don't leave it completely fallow. We like to plant it in cover crops, usually kind of summer annuals that'll die off and provide a decent cover over the winter, or sometimes rotate in a winter annual. But especially if you're in the transitional organic state of mind, incorporating your fertility early on. And then what we've really liked to do is to establish sod grass as a cover crop. We found a grass mix that's worked really well for us in an orchard vineyard setting. I believe it's called Companion Mix. There may be some other ones out there, but it's been highly competitive with both annual and perennial weeds for us. And in our bramble planting, where it's been planted for the longest time, it's really choked out almost everything. So it provides a really nice cover, and it's really nice for our U-pick customers as well. And then over that, to kill off the grass and make room for the trees or bushes, we'll mark out our rows and lay plastic at least 6 months, 6 to 9 months before we actually plan on planting. So maybe the summer before We have our sod established. We'll lay our plastic down. It gives plenty of time for the grass to die and decompose. It'll hopefully help kill off any remaining perennial weeds that would try to continue to push up. Get your irrigation lines underneath the plastic if you need them. And then planting year, we cut holes in our plastic. Our plastic's a woven black plastic that lasts probably at least 5 years. We auger in our trees. We spent our first year hand digging in about 1,000 different berry bushes, and so after that we invested in an auger, and it's made our lives much easier. Normally in an orchard environment, if you were planting a good number of trees, you would have an actual tree planter, but I haven't seen how that would work with plastic unless you left some bare ground in the middle. So we haven't gone that route, and auger seems to work really well for us. And then that first year, you really want to, you made this huge investment, and so people think their tasks are kind of done the first year after they get the trees in the ground, and really you have to be vigilant even starting that first year to keep an eye on any disease issues that might pop up, and work on keeping those populations at bay if necessary, especially in the more disease-prone stuff, which in our case tends to be our brambles, especially since we have such a significantly sized planting of them. Okay, with that, I'll jump into our different crops here. I believe I have 4 different crops that I'm going to speak a little bit about. I'm not going to read through each of these slides. Y'all can read and review what I've written up here later on. I've tried to put in as much as I can into here, but you'll still need to do some research of your own. But I wanted to take a moment to answer a few questions before we hop into the individual fruits. They're all from Carl, and one's question's asking about the Eastern lanternfly. I assume he's talking about the spotted lanternfly. So the spotted lanternfly is a recent invasive that's come into the area. It has not hit our county yet. I think it's a few counties to the east of us still. I keep asking our plant inspector. We have a small nursery as well. I keep asking our plant inspector about it, and I'm trying to get an update on preferred hosts and things like that. So far, I'm a little concerned about our kiwi berries since they are a vining crop and they supposedly like grapes. And so we're keeping an eye on it and just sort of monitoring it. It's inevitable that it's gonna come here. And we're just hoping they find a pretty decent solution for it until then. Multi-cropping in our orchard is the next question, and our thoughts on doing that, and crop biodiversity. We have a pretty diverse array of crops, and we have a meadow planted down the middle of our orchard. About 1.25 acres of the orchard is devoted to meadow, wildflower meadow, and native grasses. So we're trying to achieve our diversity that way. If we were to achieve our diversity sort of any other way, by putting plants between our plants, I understand that people do that. I just think management would start to become a problem, and because we're trying to grow organically, I think plant crowding, because we've spaced things generously, but things would eventually crowd in upon themselves. I'm just not prepared to do that, but I understand that people do it. Now maybe alley cropping, you know, we could do something like that, but then we'd have to eliminate the sod. So certainly a possibility, maybe more of a possibility in large, maybe nuts trees, where the trees get larger and you're waiting longer for them to come into bearing. And then helping the pollinators in our orchard was the other question. And we do that through our meadow. And we also have a an agreement with a local beekeeper, and he comes and keeps bees on our property for the growing season, and it's just kind of mutually beneficial agreement. He gets the honey, we get the pollination, and it's worked out well for this past year. And I see another question there about Japanese beetles, and I'll hold off on that one till the end.
Hey Tim,
Yeah,
I've got a quick question here before we move on. A little bit about your site establishment.
sure.
So you said your woven black plastic has maybe about a 5-year lifespan.
Yes.
So I'm curious about how you secure that to the ground. Do you use ground staples? Do you put mulch on it? And is that ever a problem if you're mowing your paths, or is there any maintenance or upkeep that you do with that to maintain it so it does get a good 5-year lifespan?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've seen some really poor information out there, I think, about people putting mulch over their black plastic to make it last longer and things like that. So I'm glad you brought that up. So we secure ours with ground staples. We just use 6-inch staples. I know there are 8-inch staples, and maybe where there's a lot of frost heave, that would be helpful, because I do see that first year when you put it down, when grass hasn't kind of grown over the first couple inches, excuse me, it can tend to heave up some of the staples over the winter. So 8-inch staples might work well there. In terms of making it last a long time, we try to secure it really tightly so it doesn't flap at all really in the wind. And then we try to keep vegetation off of it almost completely. And so we fasten it really tight to the ground, and then we'll run our mower deck over the edge of the plastic to keep any of the weeds that tend to creep, some of the clovers and some of the other annual weeds that do come up that tend to want to grow over the plastic because it's nice kind of warm space. We try to keep as much vegetation off it as possible, because if you do have some dirt or some vegetation and it starts to get rooted in there, it does create some small holes in the plastic, and I think it would eventually eat away at it. Does that answer your question, Steve?
Yeah, it really does. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so pawpaws. Pawpaws, if you haven't heard of them, North America's largest native fruit. They're related to fruits. All the fruits it's related to in its family are in the tropics, and so it's the only relative to make it this far north. It grows as far north as zone 5B, maybe 5A. I've heard of some folks at least raising seedlings, perhaps in 5A. Grafted plants you may have to be a bit concerned about with the graft union. But in terms of spacing, there's a lot of literature out there that says spacements closes 8 feet all the way up to maybe 15 feet. We settled in for our initial planting on 11 feet with 16 feet between the rows. Our new planting that'll be going in kind of starting next year will be 12 feet in the row and 15 feet between rows. So we're stretching ours out a considerable amount. We're going to prune them to be shorter. They do tend to be a small tree to begin with, small to medium-sized tree to begin with, and then we'll prune them to height so that we don't have to be on ladders necessarily to pick, or not really tall ladders at least. In terms of varieties that we like, we contacted Kentucky State. Kentucky State is the only university that I know of, at least, that has a breeding program, an active breeding program for pawpaws, and they released a few varieties. And they sent me a list of about 8 varieties. And so those are the ones I've chosen. I'm really partial to the Peterson varieties. They were released by Neil Peterson, and they're named after rivers: Susquehanna, Wabash, Potomac, Shenandoah. And so far, I'm a pretty big fan of Susquehanna and Shenandoah, but I'm going to do a little bit more research in the coming year or so before we graft over some seedlings and to really determine which varieties are, commercially in the few commercial orchards that are out there, the best commercially. Pawpaws do have a notoriously short shelf life. Just like if you picked a ripe banana, you'd have about a day to eat it. The same is true with a ripe pawpaw. However, we've seen, and I picked this up in a recent pawpaw book, and for the past few years it's worked, that if you pick the pawpaws when they have a little bit of give to them, kind of like a ripe avocado, it just has a little bit of give to it, pick them at that point, they'll actually keep in storage up to 2 weeks, maybe a little bit more, with really no degradation in them, and then you set them on the counter for a day and they ripen up just fine. So the fruit itself comes in these clusters. That's an unusual cluster I'm holding there. That's probably like a 3.5 to almost 4 pounder. Sometimes you'll see clusters. 2 or 3 is perhaps more common in a cluster. But those are what the cultivated varieties look like. So if you've ever seen these in the wild, and they do grow in the wild, and in Iowa, I did see on the native map, there is a little corner in southeast Iowa where they are purported to grow. But they'll tend to be kind of long and skinny. Pawpaws have a row of seeds down the middle. And so kind of the fatter they are and the more round they are, the fleshier they tend to be. So the cultivated varieties give you the flesh to seed ratio, a better flesh to seed ratio, and improve upon some characteristics of the wild ones. So a couple questions here for pawpaws before we move on. How are we storing the pawpaws? We have a small walk-in cooler that we keep around 34, and it's closed. And that seems to work fine. I don't know if there's any literature out there in terms of storage of pawpaws, but we've found that seems to work pretty well. In terms of customer demand for pawpaws, that was another question. We haven't had any issues selling all the pawpaws we can produce so far. Now we're only in the small hundreds of pounds right now, so stay tuned. But this year we sold all of our pawpaws to a local restaurant / brewery for a pawpaw beer, and didn't have any trouble getting the price that we wanted for them. So, yeah, we're continuing to plant more pawpaws. They do take a while to bear, so hopefully we can develop the market as they come into bearing. But I do see a demand there. We were getting calls all fall about them, and had to tell a lot of disappointed people that we didn't have any. But certainly investigate that if it's something that's not well known in the area. Then you may have to do a little more legwork in terms of educating your customers and building up demand. There's been a few decent stories on pawpaws lately, so perhaps there's a little bit of hype around them that'll hopefully continue to go. The last question here on pawpaws, and I'll answer some more at the end if there are any, is do we hand pollinate? The answer is no. We seem to get good enough pollination just by whatever does the pollinating, whether that's, I think it's mostly flies from what I understand, and we have had really decent fruit set without it, so we haven't had a need to hand pollinate pawpaws. Pawpaws don't have kind of a weird flower, and so they don't attract the normal pollinators, and so I think that's where that question comes from. All right, let's take a look here at kiwi berries, also called hardy kiwi. There's a couple members of this family. We grow the argutas. There's also a colomictas, which I think are even more hardy. They're like a very hardy kiwi, grow on a similar viney structure. They are related to the fuzzy ones. The fuzzy ones are subtropical to tropical, I believe, whereas these will grow, and I believe are pretty perfectly hardy down to about -20. These do need a male, so we have males interspersed among, we have I think 34 females and, sorry, 36 females and 4 males, something like that. No, 6 males anyways, so they need males at about a ratio of 5:1 to 8:1. Spacing on these is pretty variable. I worked for a grower, and I'll show you hopefully a quick picture here. A conventional grower where he was spacing his apart, I think every 10 or 11 feet. That turned out to be way too close. And I think he will eventually remove kind of every other vine. But we decided to space ours at 20 feet apart, and that was in 2016, and they've already grown together, and so we'll spend a significant amount of time pruning and keeping them out of each other's space. There's a grower north of us who grows about 20 acres of these, and he's experimented with spacing up to 40 feet apart, and even at 40 feet apart, they're good. It would take more time to fill the trellis, of course, at that point, but it may mean less pruning later on. So in terms of varieties, we grow a proprietary variety by that grower of 20 acres. I believe it's a cross of Anna with something else. But Anna, cordifolia, quite honestly, there's quite a few. Michigan, I think Changbai is a large fruited one. And so you may have to experiment around or look to growers in your area and see if there's one that does particularly well. They do tend to push out pretty late, so they tend to avoid frosts, although if you do get a really warm spell, it could trigger them. And then any new growth is pretty frost sensitive. So here's a picture of one of the clusters on kiwi berries. You prune them like grapes, so you have kind of a leader that comes up from the ground and then two permanent sort of cordons. In the winter, you prune the old growth that has these fruiting spurs on it back to something of a stub, and then it'll shoot out new laterals that have to go through a winter, and then they'll shoot out fruiting spurs all along this kind of fruiting cane here. And then that subsequent year, you can prune those back. They will flower a little bit the next year, but you're better pruning that back to a stub and starting the process over again. There's a couple questions here on kiwi berries. How many pounds per vine? I've heard up to 100 pounds per vine. Ours we're in their third leaf this year. Now we got pretty established vines to start with, and we pulled about 50 pounds off of a vine, kind of at most. But there were quite a few, with probably between 40 and 50 pounds per vine. We benefited from a late bloom to this year, and the proximity to our beehives. They were right next to the beehives, so I think the bees had an easy journey. So we got really great fruit set clusters that were much even thicker than this with berries. So was really pleased this year. Kiwi berries, the other question is, do they require full sun, or would they work on a shaded tree edge? They may work on a shaded tree edge. They really do like full sun. Most everything likes full sun. Pawpaws might put up with a little bit of shade, but even they would prefer full sun if they could get it. But they might work on a shaded tree edge. They just might not flower and fruit all that well. What's critical with kiwi berries, and I really can't emphasize this enough, is that you almost have to have a significant trellis for them. Each of these vines, or each of these shoots that shoot off of here, can grow upwards of 30 feet in a season. So if you don't have them on some kind of support structure, they're just really going to get out of control. Plus something to hold the weight of 100 pounds on this vine, along with all the foliage from the plant. Please don't try to grow them on on a fence. It may work, but it'll eventually be a pruning nightmare, and you'll just want to rip them out. All right, I'm going to touch here kind of briefly on Asian persimmons and their hybrids. we're starting to get into the stuff here that's somewhat probably marginal for Iowa climates, although it would work well. It would work well. I saw someone was from North Carolina. It would probably work well in most parts of North Carolina. Asian persimmons and their hybrids. They've hybridized Asian persimmons with the native American persimmon and produced fruits or trees that produce fruit that are like the Asian persimmons in size and flavor to some degree, but have some of the hardiness of the American persimmons. American persimmons are much more hardy. I believe they'll survive at least in the low parts of zone 5, if maybe even into zone 4 a little bit, but I could be wrong there. So the hybrids will give you fruit that's quite like the Asian ones with the benefit of additional hardiness. But even for the hybrids, I would recommend at the lowest, perhaps zone 6A, you could maybe get away with 5B if it's a pretty warm 5B. They are small, tend to be small trees as opposed to the native persimmons that can get to be almost really a full-size tree. So we're planting ours at about 12 feet in the row and 16 feet between, and that's probably giving them a pretty generous space. We tend to grow, and they seem to do pretty well for us here, even in the polar vortex winters. A couple rows of non-astringents, Giro and Ichikika along with Saijo as an astringent. The astringent ones have to be soft when ripe, like the American persimmons. If you pick them too early, they have that astringent kind of puckery taste to them. All of the hybrids are astringent. So if you get into those, there are no non-astringent, eat when hard hybrids as of now. There are continuing efforts by amateurs to breed some hybrids that are even more hardy, and maybe it's possible to get a non-astringent hybrid, but we'll see. So there's a picture of one of our Asian persimmons, Great Wall. It's a really beautiful plant if you can get it to grow. So if you have an opportunity to grow one, even the native ones have pretty leaves, but I love the glossy leaves on the Asian persimmons. All right, so let me touch on figs here. I believe it's my last fruit to cover, and then we'll cover a little bit about marketing here. Figs are a subtropical fruit. They are a subtropical fruit that I'll put a caveat with. They're pretty hard to kill. So in zone 6, especially with protection, maybe into zone 5 with extreme protection, you could grow figs. Figs fruit on new wood, new growth. And so even if the wood, even if they're top killed and have to kind of restart from the crown of the plant, they can still produce fruit that year, provided you have a warm and long enough summer. And so we tend to grow varieties here that satisfy a few different conditions. One, they have to be able to take that dye back to the ground and still fruit some the following year. And they have to be rain resistant. Figs, like cherries, if they get an ill-timed rain around ripening time, can tend to split and crack. But there are some varieties that have been bred or just naturally resistant to rain. So a variety we really like is Improved Celeste. It's a very early ripening variety that's also rain resistant, and it tastes good. So we've gone to planting that in our geothermally heated tunnels and outside as well. Hardy Chicago, maybe one that some of you have heard of. We like that one as well. It ripens a little later than Improved Celeste, but still ripens in our season. And then there's a variety, at least in the trades, called Floria, that's also very early. It does have some issues with splitting, but it's a good variety. Storage life on figs is very short, which is good and bad. Somewhat, good for you in that if you can get them to ripen. There's not going to be a lot of restaurants and areas around that have figs. The ones that are flown in from California just really aren't that good. They're picked way too early and they don't ripen very well off of the plant. And so I think there's a real opportunity there if you can get them to grow. They also have really no pests and diseases of significance. Some folks have mentioned spotwing Drosophila as being an issue, and I really haven't seen that in ours. I know some people have. I don't know if it's because we have brambles and they're drawn to brambles more than they are the figs, but I really haven't seen any spotwing Drosophila in our plants, and really no leaf diseases. In the south, they do get a rust that overwinters in the south, but the spores don't overwinter up here, so I really don't even see any rust issues. So here are a couple pictures of fruit. Fruit are really varied from figs. They can be a variety of colors, a variety of sizes, a variety of flavors, probably under cultivation longer than any other plant in existence. So there's quite a few varieties out there. And so we've had a hard time paring down and finding ones that really do well consistently in our climate. So if you're looking to grow the typical black mission, and this variety here in the lower left is sort of a black mission type. Those are not really ones for short season climates. They require a longer and hotter season than what we typically have, except if we're growing in containers. This one up in the upper right is a variety we do grow in ground called Latarola. It might be Latarola or Atriano. It's a large green fig with kind of a red interior, and it's a decent fig. In general, the larger the fig, the more watery it can tend to be when it ripens, and so we tend toward the sort of medium-sized fig for a happy medium. Okay, let me take a quick drink of water here. Answer a couple more questions. There's a question here about how long it takes kiwis to bear fruit. Ours, I've heard it takes 3 to 5 years. Ours really, we got some established plants to start with that were already trained to the top wire, and really ours fruited a little bit the first year. So if they're pruned well, I don't see really any reason why they wouldn't want to bear after maybe 2 or 3 years. Even if you're starting them from a pretty small plant. And so, yeah, I haven't seen them to be shy of fruiting. Maybe if they were grown in shade or had pollination issues, they might be a little bit shy to fruit. In terms of geothermal tunnels, I'm going to examine that on the next slide. That's one of the questions. And then there's a question here on Japanese beetles and honeyberries. I'll try to get to that at the end. And then there's a question here from Katie on selling cuttings after pruning back. If you could specify what type of cuttings. We do sell fig cuttings. And that's really the only thing that we winter protect. So I assume you're talking about figs there. Great. Yep, figs. We do sell fig cuttings, so if you'll contact us through our website, we can help you through there. So in terms of extending our climate zone or extending our growing season, we started looking a few years ago at ways to reliably extend our growing season and provide some protection from our figs, and didn't like the idea of attaching a propane heater to the house. One, just the economics of it didn't seem to work out. We'd be going through probably a few hundred gallons of propane per year just to try to keep the figs alive. And so we looked at other systems that were a little less energy intensive and came across this concept of climate battery or earth tubes. It's been called a bunch of different things. It's at its core, it's just an air-to-air geothermal system. And so what we do is use the ground as thermal mass And when the greenhouse is overly hot, we pump that warm, moist air underground where it condenses and releases a lot of energy and heat into the ground, and then comes back on the other side of the greenhouse cool, and that ground has absorbed some of that heat that we can then use at nighttime or when the temperature drops again. And so if you're interested in that, I'm not going to spend too much time on that other than to say Penn State is out here studying the 2 greenhouses now we have up with that sort of system, um, just to see if they can improve upon the design. I'm sure they can. And there's more information on our website. We kept a daily or a weekly log of stats, temperature-wise, what it was outside, what it was inside, what the ground temperature was, just to get an idea of how to best operate these systems. I'm a data nerd by background, and so I like collecting information, trying to analyze and improve upon it. All right, so in terms of marketing, we're getting pretty close. We're almost up to 8 o'clock your time here, and so I'll try to get through these pretty readily. How do we market our unusual fruits? There are certainly some benefits to growing perennial crops, in that even if you plant a fairly large planting, it usually takes a few years for that crop to come into production, and so it's not an all-at-once sort of thing. So even if your plants, your pawpaw planting is capable of producing a few thousand pounds of fruit a year, you're not going to have that all at once. You're probably going to get maybe a few pounds, maybe 50 to 100 pounds in your first crop, and then maybe a few hundred pounds the subsequent years, and then it's going to ramp up. And so there's certainly a benefit to that in terms of it not having to clear it all out at once, and kind of trying to grow your markets there. And so what we've done is try to find farm-to-table restaurants in the area. They're fairly popular in the area, and the chefs that we work with are always wanting to try kind of new and unique fruits and flavors, and have something to differentiate themselves. And so our fruit fits that bill. And when they're used to getting, for example, figs from California, and they're just not really happy with the quality, they're really pleased to get local produce that they normally have to order from out of town. Breweries, if you're not opposed to working with breweries, they're a great outlet for fruit as well. You might not get retail prices for your fruit, but it's a way to clear a significant amount of fruit out at one time. We try to utilize as much as possible different forms of advertising, really free advertising, social media. We try to push and explain what the different fruits are that we grow, hopefully a little bit in advance of when they come into season. And then we also utilize as much as we can signage and samples at our stand. Our signage would include, what is this fruit? What is a pawpaw? How do I know when it's ripe? What does it taste like? Try to remove those barriers, kind of those barriers to entry that would keep someone from trying it. Usually curiosity will get them to buy at least one fruit if they're kind of an adventurous type. And then if you do farmers markets, it's really interesting to see the people that'll kind of peer at your signs and look at it, and you have to kind of usher over to the table to get them to try it, versus the ones that are adventurous and they'll just come over and grab one. So that's worked pretty well. We went from having almost 0 pounds of kiwi berries this year to having 600 pounds of kiwi berries. And so that's having samples and getting people to try it, and then building that customer base from there. When you're one of the only games in town for some of the unusual fruits, eventually people do find you and come to know you for those things. We have some really dedicated customers for figs, and this year was not a great year for figs, but that call constantly almost over the summer asking when the figs will be ready. So just be persistent at it and know that, it won't be an all at once sort of thing, hopefully. In terms of interest and what we've seen, the biggest interest, the biggest two for us so far, and we're relatively new, is figs and pawpaws. We've seen a really decent demand for both. We've been able to sell really all the figs that we can grow, and so far all the pawpaws as well. I think pawpaws are a really interesting fruit. I think they're a great fruit. And so we're raising a lot more in anticipation that the demand will be significant. Then followed by kiwi berries and Asian persimmons. We tend not to grow. I know there's a bunch of other unusual fruits. There was a question here about honeyberries that I can answer now. We did look at honeyberries. We're tending to shy away from a lot of other small fruits other than our brambles, and I wouldn't probably plant any more brambles, maybe blackberries if anything, just because I don't see the margin there in order to make my money back on them and get a decent return on my investment. The fruit is so small and takes so long to pick, especially with honeyberries. I have grown them before, but they're tiny and they tend to hide a little bit in the bush. They're not like blueberries, at least the blueberries I'm used to, that that kind of stick out at you. The honeyberries you kind of have to search for a little bit from what I've seen. So so we're tending to shy away from those really in any quantity. I could see growing a few here and there, but nothing for really commercial use. All right. I'm going to talk briefly about the nursery operation, and then if you all want to start, if there are any other remaining questions, if you want to start asking those, and I can kind of go through them at the end here. We do have a small nursery operation on the farm. It is primarily there to help us plant out the orchard at this point, since we are growing a lot of unusuals. Especially a lot of figs. It really helps to have an inexpensive means of propagating a bunch of plants. And so we do sell a number of fig trees every year. We do sell some cuttings. And that adds up. I looked at the numbers today. This year it was 10 to 20% of our revenue. So it's not insignificant. Our revenues aren't awesome at this point since we're a new operation, but 10 to 20% of our revenue is not bad, and it provides us a really great avenue to inexpensively plan out the orchard. We'll be adding pawpaws and persimmons at some later point. I just really like the idea of grafting my own trees, and so pawpaws and persimmons will add to the list of what we offer as well, if we have any extras or just maybe a few on the side to supplement our income and broaden the nursery operation. The drawback of the nursery operation, of course, is that it's just another thing to manage, which during the middle of the season we don't really want or need, but we try to automate everything as much as possible. So we fertigate. We don't synthetically fertilize really anything on the property except for our nursery plants. So we'll fertigate those, and they're set up on automatic timers for watering. And so besides checking on them every so often, we really don't spend a ton of time managing them after the grafting and the initial care of setting them up on the drippers and the spray stakes. All right. So with that, I'll answer your question. Steve, did you want to chime in with anything?
No, that's great. Yeah, I did want to mention though that we do have time for questions, and so if there's something that Tim didn't cover, sounds like he's willing to cover that stuff now, and we've got a little time. So go ahead and get it in the chat box. But thanks, Tim. This has been great.
Yeah, great. Hope it's been really helpful. And if I didn't explain something well, hopefully I can answer your questions here and try to do a little better job of that. So
Yeah, I think just from what I saw in the questions while we were kind of a little bit on the marketing was a question about whether or not you're willing to share, I guess, any pricing structures as it compared from from retail sales to wholesale, and maybe how you might compare to others, larger growers, or if you can get a premium, anything like that that you'd be willing to share.
sure. So yeah, what we get, we typically do provide a little bit of a discount for wholesale. We didn't have to this year with our pawpaws. So yeah, I don't mind sharing pawpaws. We're asking currently $5 a pound. And so I don't know what they go for. I think that's comparable to, from what I've seen, some of the farmers markets in the area charging. And from what I've seen, I like our product a good bit more from what, based on what I've seen. I don't know if they get some foraged pawpaws or what, but um, so I think that's a pretty fair price. And then figs, we do them by the half pint. We charge essentially what's close to $1 a fig. Um, we do a little bit of a discount there for wholesale if they buy in flat quantities, and I think drop it down to $4.50 or $4.25 per half pint. For kiwi berries, we ended up this year, I think, at $3 a half pint, $5 a pint. Kiwi berries were a nice fruit in terms of harvest because they're a harvest all at once sort of fruit, and so they're a little more economical to harvest than a lot of the other small fruits, the cane fruits. And then let me think here: kiwis, pawpaws. Yeah, we haven't marketed a lot of persimmons yet. I think we were on the order of $3 to $4 a pound on Asian persimmons, but that's in a very limited capacity. So I hope that answers your question there. It can be hard to price some of these fruits, and it may really depend on your market too, and your competition as well. So. All right, I'm just going to go down through the questions kind of in the order they were asked, unless there are some that go together here. There's a question here on Japanese beetles as a problem in our brambles. Yes, we do have Japanese beetles. They tend to focus on the raspberries, I think, more than anything. They do bother the kiwi berries a little bit from year to year, although this year not maybe as much. They tend to just, for the most part, for us, eat the leaves rather than bother the fruit. And so we haven't done much in terms of a spray to hit them. They really weren't a heavy problem this year like they've been in previous years. So we really didn't treat them at all. I've heard there is a BT product that's supposed to work on them. They do bug the customers more than anything. And so if they would be more of a problem in the future, we would probably treat for them. All right, special concerns of overwintering fig trees. That's a topic in and of itself. There are a variety of ways to overwinter fig trees. On a commercial basis, we've tried doubling over really heavyweight row cover, and these are on our outside trees, the ones not in tunnels. That worked okay when it got down to 0 here. If you're getting into the negatives in Fahrenheit, you'd have to do some more drastic means of protecting your fig trees. So there's been some folks that have gone so far as to bury them, which really isn't possible on a commercial basis unless you have some heavy equipment or a lot of extra hands. I don't know that the economics of it would work out. where they actually kind of lean the tree over and really bury it in soil to protect it. So yeah, it really depends on your climate. You could probably, in some climates, get away with just sort of wind protecting it or wrapping it. And in the really harsh climates, you might need to build a structure around it and partially heat it just to keep it from freezing really, really hard. Hope that answered your question there. Here's a question about drain tile and installing those between rows of trees. Yeah, I don't see a reason why you wouldn't or couldn't install drain tile. When I worked for an orchard, he was in fairly heavy clay soils, and he installed, I think, miles of drain pipe from what I've heard in between these rows to get water moving in and out of the trees. So yeah, that's definitely a good idea and something you definitely want to hit ahead of time rather than run into it later. When we inherited this site, there were some areas of standing water. Now we're not in heavy clay, although there are some areas where the topsoil is pretty thin. And just putting it under permanent cover for a number of years really helped with drainage. So I don't know if that's your situation, but that helped us. But yeah, certainly drain tile can help. Can any of the 4 fruits here is the question be raised organically in your climate? Yeah, I don't see a reason why not. We haven't used any prohibited substances here, and we're transitional organic. So I think any of those 4 would be perfectly suited to an organic system. There's a question about what size in acres did you start with your first year? The whole property is 13 acres. We started with about 1.5 acres of planting. So about 1.25 acres, 1.25 acres of brambles, and then about 1/4 to 1/3 of an acre of kiwi berries that first year. And that was probably a little bit too much. We didn't really take into consideration all the trellising, and we didn't have an extra set of hands that first year. Since then, we've hired a summer helper that's really helped with projects, and so we were still playing catch up that second year with getting all the berry trellis in, and we didn't really have all of our systems going really well that first year. So they made a lot of mistakes, but we've continued with planting about 1 acre a year, but we just try to do it more smartly and try to do everything ahead of time that we can to prepare for the following year. Any good info on building budgets, enterprise budgets? That is a good question. If you clarify what you mean, I'm not sure what you mean exactly by enterprise budgets, so I'd be glad to answer that. If I can get a little more information on enterprise budgets. The next question here is, did you shade your pawpaws for the first year? We did not. Our thought is the pawpaws are shaded. They're usually grown out for a year before we get them. And so it's really only the first year that you need to shade them, unless you live really in the kind of hot, humid south where the sun's a little more intense. And so, yeah, we didn't need to shade the pawpaws the first year. Really the key with pawpaws we found is providing them a really, really, really good non-competitive space, and the black woven black plastic really goes a long way toward helping with that. And so usually the first year the pawpaws just kind of sit there and look sad, but then the second and third year they really take off. Budgets for, okay, so the question clarified what they meant by enterprise budgets. Sorry, I have a lack of knowledge there. Budgets for planning purposes, expenses, and potential revenues. That just sort of came from research. So I tried to research, expected yield from the trees, and then kind of extrapolated that out to the planting. And again, I guess that would be one of the risks of growing unusual fruits, is that there's not a lot of solid data out there from established orchards that says, this is what you can expect out of an acre of figs in a northern climate, sort of thing, or pawpaws, because it's such a relatively new commercial crop.
Right. Yeah, Tim, I'm going to jump in real quick
Sure.
too, because Practical Farmers does some work with enterprise budgets
Oh,
with
perfect.
beginning farmers who are planning out. And just like you said, sometimes it can be really tricky because there's not a lot of available information for certain crops in certain regions. So trying to plan out what you'd expect for not only like your yield, but then also trying to evaluate what the income is for those. So some of the crops, you can't just go to the market and see, oh, this is what everybody else charges, because some of them are unusual enough. Maybe there's not anything to compare it to, so you don't know quite what you
Right,
can get for it.
right. Or there can be a wide variation. If
Yeah.
there's a bunch of people that forage pawpaws in your area, and
Oh,
they
sure.
offer the market same time that you do, and there can be a little bit of, yeah,
Yeah.
competition.
But Michael, you could go, if you go to practicalfarmers.org, and there's right at the top is a resources button. If you click that and search enterprise budgets, there's a couple of different things that should come up that'll give you, maybe some stuff to go off of. But I think a lot of the crops that, especially that Tim's growing, does require, kind of your own research to figure out what those numbers are.
Yep, yep. So we certainly put together a few spreadsheets that try to, estimate that out. Even labor-wise, getting an idea of what it's going to take to prune that and fertilize that, and just try to estimate all those different things. Value added products. We do some value added products now with our brambles. So any of the berries that don't sell on a day-to-day basis, since they do go bad so quickly, we freeze and bag and sell it either as frozen. You get some of that processed into jams and jellies now. We also sell some of the honey produced on the farm. That's not really value added, that's just a product. But yeah, I would like to get into a little bit more of that. That might be a little trickier. We do want to try a kiwi berry jam here in the future, maybe a kiwi berry strawberry, something like that. I can see that going well together. So yeah, stay tuned. But yeah, that's certainly a great avenue. I love shelf stable produce that you don't have to refrigerate or freeze to keep it around. So yeah, that's a great great avenue for that. And if anyone has any suggestions for value added pawpaw stuff, I'm all ears. There's a comment here that says drainage tile on tree roots, very bad idea. I would say it probably depends on the tree roots, and how far the drainage tile was away, and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's possible that roots could invade it, but I don't know a whole lot of other ways to deal with water. Can you mechanize any portions of your production system to cut labor? Oh, that's a great question. If I could, I would. I'm sure there is eventually. I know they're looking at mechanizing sort of apple pruning and some of that sort of stuff, but I think we're a long way away perhaps from mechanizing pawpaw pruning or kiwi berry pruning. There's too many choices that go into it in terms of mechanizing harvest. Again, some of our fruits, because you have to pick them at almost the exact right time. I'm thinking especially pawpaws and figs. I think it'd be pretty hard to mechanize that. But hey, if you have any suggestions, I'm more than willing to listen. And there's a suggestion for pawpaw baby food. Hey, that might not be bad. Once we have.
Yeah, I was going to say Redford Farm held a field day this year, and Tom and Kathy worked with a local restaurant for pawpaw ice cream, and it was hands
Oh,
down the best ice cream I've ever had. It was
pawpaw ice cream's
fantastic.
phenomenal. I did not
Yeah.
mention that. Yeah.
So tell us, Tim, though, quickly. Did you say you worked with a restaurant brewery? Did I see that you do some kind of a pawpaw beer or something like that?
We did. They did a pawpaw Belgian blonde ale,
Oh,
I think. And I had some, and it was, I couldn't, honestly, I couldn't taste the pawpaw all that much,
uh-huh.
but I don't have a very discerning palate, so I wouldn't go on me. But from all indications, it appears to have sold well, so that's what uh, matters in the end.
Yeah, very cool. And the craft brewery movement might be a really good place to look for a market with anything, any kind of interesting fruits and stuff like this.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah, we sold over 100, I think 150 pounds of kiwi berries to another local brewer who's making a sour beer
Oh,
with it. So, yeah, definitely. At ice cream places, I did not mention that. It's a great avenue. So, if you have any local ice cream makers, yeah, yeah,
hmm.
Paw Paw ice cream is the best. That's
Well, very cool. There was a couple comments then I saw that when we were talking about the Japanese beetles, looks like Deb recommended that she's gone around to shake. Um, the chickens will follow her around as she goes around and shake the trees and vines, and the beetles fall and the chickens will eat them up. Have you, Tim, thought about at all incorporating livestock into your system in any way for that
yeah.
kind of reason? Or
We used to have chickens. We don't anymore. They may work in a system like that. I would worry a little bit if we would get into the food safety stuff with chickens and manure and the. I just worry about with all the the coming regulations
yeah,
that it would eventually be a concern there. If um, yeah, or if we allowed sheep or something like that or goats in the orchard. One, that they'd just destroy all of our trees, but two, we'd have to time it right so that we didn't have the concerns with the manure concerns and food safety. So.
yeah, yeah. Well, that it works out pretty well with our timing to wrap up all the questions in there. So, Tim, I definitely want to say thank you for taking the time to share all this with us. I wish the best for your farm. It looks like it's got so much interesting stuff going on. I'll definitely be following you on social media. You guys are sharing good, interesting stuff there. And for anybody else, by the way, threefoldfarm.org is their website, and they've got some really cool stuff on there. If you want to see the varieties that they've got it with all the figs and a bunch of other cool stuff. So keep an eye on Threefold Farm. Thanks everybody for tuning in tonight and for participating in the chat box. And Tim, thanks again for doing this for us. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's been a real honor to come and talk to you and share what we've learned here.
Yeah, maybe we'll catch up in a few years again. Do it again.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds great.
Cool.
Thanks so much, Steve, and
Yep.
thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.